You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. We're both lifelong hunters, deer biologists, professors of wildlife management, and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. We explain the latest research, including our own work and that conducted elsewhere.
So if you're interested in deer biology and management, this is your podcast. Every decision you make is a step in your management program, and we give you the knowledge to make every decision count. Welcome back to the Deer University podcast. This is Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris.
Welcome, Steve. How are you doing?
I'm wonderful. It's so great. I love talking to people around the country, but I most love when we can talk to and with one of our graduate students from the MSU Deer Lab that kind of highlight what they've learned.
Well, I enjoy that as well. For a lot of reasons, I like talking about what they did. I also like when they are wrapping up, as our guest today has just completed his master's degree, defended his thesis a few days ago, and we're always happy to celebrate that. So today we have Moriah Boggess. Moriah, welcome. How are you?
I'm doing great. Super excited to be here and talk about the last couple years and kind of put a bow on everything that's gone on and what we found with this research.
Real quick, Moriah, before we get going, tell everybody just a snapshot where you're from and how you arrived at Mississippi State.
So I'm from the mountains of North Carolina. I went to undergrad at North Carolina State University for fisheries, wildlife, and conservation biology, and I wrapped up there, and then I accepted a position here at the Deer Lab looking at oak regeneration, looking at fire, deer, and oak regeneration and how they all relate in upland hardwood systems. And I started that in, I would have been late summer of 2018, so just about 2 years ago. And I've been here since then working on that and just now wrapping up and kind of concluding things and everything, all the work I've been doing over the last few years.
Time has really flown by. It has really gone by fast. And, one thing, another part of your bio you didn't mention is that I'm not going to ask you where it occurred, give away any of your little honey holes, but you also successfully harvested 2 elk this past season.
Yeah. Also, so the last 2 years have flown by, but there's been some really cool highlights, and like you're talking about with the hunting, that hunt last year with the elk, I never dreamed I would ever really kill an elk, much less 2, a bull and a cow back to back. And I must say too, just a plug for Mississippi while we're on the hunting subject, that coming from North Carolina to Mississippi, the deer hunting down here is excellent. I've hunted a lot and enjoyed my time here greatly because of all the opportunity there is around here with all the public land to hunt around Starkville. And I don't want to start having everybody move in on y'all's spots since I'm moving out, but I will say it has been fun to be here and get to do a little hunting on the side too.
Yeah, Mariah, I'm going to cut that out because we don't want to be swamped with too many people from out of state. No, I completely agree.
Flocking in.
We have abundant natural resource availability here in Mississippi. That's one of the many great things about living here. Well, let's jump right in and talk about your project from the 30,000 feet view. You're interested in deer. You're really interested in prescribed fire. And you're interested in masting, or another way of saying that would be acorns, acorn availability, selection by deer, etc. So just real generally, why don't you kind of introduce what you did in that regard for your master's degree?
Okay. So I think starting out, I'll talk a little bit about a project that never really happened. That's actually why I came here. Originally, the project I started on, we're looking at the difference in timing of prescribed fire in upland hardwood systems. So working with my advisor, Dr. Lashley, who gave me the position here, he had, in his master's work, done a lot of work with upland hardwoods in Tennessee, with upland oaks. And some of the recent work, which of course you guys have discussed on the podcast, with mineral stumps and this relationship between oaks and non-oaks sprouting, responding to fire, being top killed and resprouting. What I wanted to look at under Dr. Lashley's guidance was looking at the response of oaks and non-oaks to fire, and then how deer affected the relationship of those non-oaks like maple, sweet gum, some of these other species that in a lot of systems they don't traditionally browse a lot, but when they're top killed by fire, that they'll browse very readily with those mineral stumps, and how that relationship of deer herbivory could potentially affect how well oak seedlings could compete with those non-oaks. So that was the general idea going into this project, and looking at that fire timing. And so to just kind of the setting for the whole project is as well, anyone who is in the wildlife field knows, or any outdoor field research knows, it's very difficult to get the proper weather, the proper conditions to do everything. And growing season fire has been pretty much impossible, at least on my study site in northern Mississippi, over the last 2 years. I know we've tried 4 or 5 different times since I've been here to implement growing season fire in that system, and we've got so many non-oak hardwoods in there now in a closed canopy that it's just difficult to get fire in there. So that was my original idea coming in, and I was going to do these large burns that were an acre in size, and 5 of them up there. And without ever getting the right weather conditions, we had to go back to the drawing board and kind of take a smaller chunk of that picture, something that we could do manageably, manipulative experiments in the field that didn't require large growing season fire. So we came up with a couple different questions we wanted to ask, and they all relate to deer in some way, or other seed predators that relate to deer in removing acorns from oak trees, and how that affects regeneration. So just from a high point of view, the first project I did was simulating a mast crop versus a non-mast crop. And for everyone out there, all the hunters, we know what a mast crop looks like. In the fall when we're deer hunting, we're always going out early season, usually looking for those first trees that are dropping a lot of acorns. And we say that they're experiencing a mast year. Those are trees that are producing a lot of seed that year, those acorns. And then they'll usually go a few years, 1, 2, 3, or 4 years before they have another large mast year like that, where they produce a lot of seed. So hunters are very familiar with that idea, even if they don't realize it. We go out in the field and we identify, these trees are dropping this year. Some years, as hunters, we know the white oaks are dropping this year, or this particular species of the red oaks is dropping this year. So that was what I wanted to look at, was how these mast crops affected deer use, and then how deer use, as deer responded to these mast crops, how that affected the plant communities under these trees, and also oak regeneration. So that first project, what I did was I simulated a mast crop underneath trees, and like any good science experiment, you have to have a control. So you have to have trees that don't have a mast crop, or have very little mast or acorn availability, and then other ones where you have a lot. So that was the first big challenge in my research after being here a month or two, was Dr. Lashley and I sat down. We had to figure out how to simulate a mast crop, and generally during a mast crop you'll have 30, 40, even 50 or more acorns per a square meter. And if you think about the size of a canopy of a tree, that's a lot of acorns. So that was one challenge we came upon really early, because in that experiment I had 25 trees I had to add acorns to, and that added up to be 75,000 acorns, which that all worked out. And a thank you to Native Nurseries, Mossy Oak Native Nurseries. They really helped us out with that project in loaning us the equipment to pick up those acorns. And that was my experiment there. And then I looked at how deer responded to those trees using trail cameras set underneath the trees, measured deer response, looking at photos, and then how many acorns were being removed using marked acorns. And then also I did vegetation surveys there. And that was the first main project I did. And another one I want to talk about a little bit later in the podcast as we get to it is looking at fire and how fire affects the removal of acorns. And so I burned some acorns and then had some unburned, and then again monitored with trail cameras how seed predators responded to those acorns and at the rate at which they were removed, and measured that. So I guess one other thing, just to kind of set this all up, why this is important, why I'm looking at oak regeneration, because I'm sure everyone listening who's a deer hunter has sat in an oak tree, a big oak tree, and shot deer under it. There's plenty of seed falling. Everything seems fine. It seems like there's plenty of oaks. And right now there is, but we're seeing oak regeneration, or the reproduction of oaks, largely failing across the East. We have large overstory oak trees right now, but those aren't being replaced. We have seedlings becoming established pretty well across eastern forests, but those seedlings aren't moving up into the mid-story. So there's this gap in the oak regeneration cycle, and if something isn't done, eventually these large trees we have now are going to die, because they're not going to live forever. And we have all these other species like red maple and sweet gum and tulip poplar that are prone to take the spot of all those oak trees. So broadly, the question of oak regeneration is a big one for forest ecologists and wildlife ecologists. Any species that relies on acorns could be greatly impacted by this decrease in oak regeneration. So that was the reason for these projects, and that was kind of the background to them. That's what I did as far as the manipulative part of these projects, and then measured the results.
So for our listeners, it's almost like if you're thinking about the oak problem, it's kind of like a deer herd. You got a bunch of mature deer, and you're producing some fawns every year in terms of acorns and old mature oak trees. Nothing in the middle age classes, so to speak. So
right.
There's kind of that gap we're talking about. So, Mariah, you were a small part in the big question of trying to figure out what's going on with recruitment. The same way we do it in a deer herd. We're putting fawns on the ground, but what's happening? Why aren't they recruited into the population? A lot of people too, Mariah, aren't typically thinking of deer as a predator. But from an acorn's perspective, as you mentioned, they are a seed predator. So that's probably a new term for people thinking of deer as a predator.
Yeah, it's they're definitely a prey item for everything else, including humans. But that is the one point of view. From an acorn's point of view, or even a young oak seedling, a deer is a big, bad, scary predator, almost like we are to the deer.
Yeah. Do you want to show us now? We want to talk about some of your results?
Yeah, we can. So I guess I want to describe how we did these treatments real quick. So when setting up this project, we had 50 trees. So I had 50 oak trees that I identified. So I had 50 oak trees that I had to add acorns to. And this is the machine I picked up acorns with in Starkville, Mississippi, where Mississippi State is. And even on campus, we use this machine to pick up all the acorns. And this machine is actually used in some like seed orchards, like pecan orchards and such. And as you can see, it has a drum that kind of has these teeth, and it picks up acorns and then throws them into a bin as you roll it around, kind of like a push lawnmower, if you will, if you kind of imagine something like that. And I used that to pick up all these acorns and store them in refrigeration, and then I added them to the trees. And I did that over the first 3 weeks of November. And this project was actually done in 2018, and that fall. So compared to some states, like in North Carolina, where I'm from, our acorns are dropping beginning of October, even late September. But here in Mississippi, a lot of our oaks, a lot of the oak species we have drop in November, like the southern red oaks, and the Schumars are sometimes even later. But I added these acorns to my trees over the first 3 weeks of November, and I added acorns for 3 weeks in a row. I added 500 the first week to every tree, and then 2,000 the next week and 500 the next week. And I just threw them out by hand because there's really no great way to distribute acorns. I thought about using a food plot seed spreader, but nothing has a way to spread a seed that large. So I did it all by hand and added these acorns to my plots. And then I measured the
Moriah, just to
Yes.
give people an idea, and just a crude approximation here, about how many 5-gallon buckets of acorns did you collect?
So there's, I averaged out how many acorns are in a bucket, in a 1-gallon bucket. And so I counted that bucket, I think 10 or 15 times with a full bucket of acorns. I would count all the way through them, and then I averaged that out. And it averaged out to be 500 acorns. I believe it was actually 501 is the average number of Shumard oak acorns that fit in a gallon bucket. So everybody knows that now. We've all learned something if anyone's measuring Shumard oak acorns. So each tree would receive 6 buckets in all over those 3 weeks. But overall, during my study, I collected, if you think of like a feed sack, where if you were to go and buy a sack of wheat or a sack of corn and it was completely full, a burlap sack, I picked up 13 of those sacks of acorns for the whole project overall. So about enough to fill up a truck bed when the bags were full, and added those to the plots and then monitored everything visiting those plots, mainly deer, using trail cameras from that first week of November all the way through the end of March. And had a lot of deer respond. And one thing I found really cool from a deer hunting perspective, which I wasn't hunting these deer, I was just going through these photos after the fact and seeing what had happened over winter as I was putting in this data. But one thing I found really interesting was how deer not only increased their use of these plots in respect to a lot more feeding happening here, but when deer were responding to the acorns here, they were coming to feed, they would also bed down. And that's one thing I noticed, a behavior I noticed in the trees where I didn't add acorns. I really didn't have that happen. I would have a few deer walk through once in a while, and some would stop and eat a little bit, but underneath the trees I had added acorns. I would have deer come in, they would eat for 10, 20, 30 minutes, they would lay down for an hour, then they would get up, they would eat some more, and they would lay down. And in one photo sequence, I even had a young buck come and do that, and he laid down, and then 30 minutes later, a mature buck walked up to him and postured up to him. This was, I think it was the tail end of the rut, kind of post-rut. This mature buck walks up to this younger buck and postures up to him and pushes the younger buck out of the frame of the trail camera, and then he basically took over the spot and proceeded to eating acorns. So I was seeing deer respond to these oak trees in a big way, which was very interesting from a hunting point of view. And when we look at the deer response, when I graph it out by week, the thing that really jumps out at me as a deer hunter, we so traditionally think about, or maybe I'm the only one, but I think in all, as deer hunters, we think about deer responding to mast when the acorns are dropping. And that's not what I saw with my results at all, actually. They did respond from the beginning, but the greatest response was delayed about 2 months after the acorns had fallen, which I think is important to point out one thing too here. These acorns that I was adding were Shumard oak acorns, so they belong to the red oak group, or the red oak subgenus. And just to break this down real quick, because I'm talking about different acorn species and all, everyone I'm sure is familiar with red oak versus white oak. That's thrown around a lot. Technically, red oak versus white oak, those are two different subgenus or subgenera of oaks. And there is a white oak that is actually called a white oak, and we have those across the southeast. But all the species in the white oak subgenus, which we have a few, like post oak, like white oak, like swamp chestnut oak, those species, when they fall on the ground, those acorns germinate very quickly. In fact, I've tried to collect some of those for different various experiments. And even if I pick them up the day they drop and I put them in refrigeration and try to keep moisture levels low, they germinate in refrigeration within a day or two. Those acorns are prone to germinate very quickly. And that's that strategy of white oaks. Everything in the white oak subgenus does that. They germinate very quickly. But red oaks are different. Those acorns overwinter as an acorn or as a seed. and so they have to spend winter on the ground before they'll germinate. So those acorns are available for seed predators, like we're talking about with deer or squirrels or whatever you want to talk about. They're available all through the winter, and then they germinate in spring. So that's what I was using here. Shumard oak is one of the red oak species. So these acorns weren't germinating. They were available throughout the year. So if you're thinking about this from a land management point of view or a deer hunting point of view, that's something an important point to consider. Is the species of oak is very important to this response, because I guarantee you we wouldn't have seen this response with white oaks because they would have been germinated. But what I saw here was from the first week of November, there was an increase in the number of deer feeding photos within my plots, which is the metric I use to measure deer response to these acorns. And there was this increase in deer use in these plots, if you will, for pretty much the entire study period. Till the end of February, there was a sizable increase in deer use in these plots. And then about the beginning of March, it slacked off, so there really wasn't a difference between an acorn addition plot or my control plot, so where I added acorns or not. But as we look at the deer response, it doesn't peak until about the second week of January, which is very, very, very interesting, because these acorns, like I said, have been on the ground for 2 months. And on the study site, this is in northern Mississippi, not super far from Memphis, Tennessee. The rut timing here is usually the first, I think I'm trying to remember the peak date. I think it's the first week of December, if my memory serves me well. The first week of December is when the peak of breeding takes place on this study site. And we saw a little peak in deer use there, and then it kind of dropped off for a week or two. And then we see this huge response by deer visiting these acorn trees where I've added acorns. So from a deer hunting point of view, if you're looking at the data from my cameras underneath these Shumard oaks, the best time to hunt those trees would have been the second and third week of January, which is a long time after those acorns have hit the ground. And
I don't think anyone would have expected that. I certainly did not.
Yeah.
So you've got well over, what are you looking at? Well over, you got 6 weeks just about from the peak of the rut. 5 weeks, 6 weeks?
Right, before they peak in their use of these acorns, or eating these acorns, responding to them. Yeah.
And so what do you think's the reason for that, Moriah?
So there could be a lot of different things that are causing this, and I think like any scientist thinking about deer as a ruminant, as an herbivore on the landscape, there's so many different things these deer can eat. And actually on the study site, one important thing to know for context is there is a lot of agriculture. There's bean fields and corn fields, which those foods were not available at this time. But in October, November, there were cover crops planted in those fields, which were radishes and winter wheat. And so all through winter, there was radishes and winter wheat available to these deer. But at some point, there was this lag after the peak of the rut, and then deer responded to these oak trees. And I think it's difficult to say exactly why deer responded when they did. But part of that may be just the digestibility of those cover crops, and switching over to acorns may have been more nutritionally beneficial at that point in time. I guess my short answer there is there's a lot going on. But the important thing from a land management point of view is that while acorns are available throughout the winter, we see them using them, particularly at this 2 or 3 week time point in January. It's obvious that they're important to deer then. So again, this is just a reason why you need many different food types on your property. If you were to just be feeding deer nothing but an alfalfa field all winter long, it's probably not providing what they need throughout the years. Deer, don't eat one thing all through the year, and I think my data kind of shows that we're definitely seeing them switch to acorns for a while, but then they eventually slack off from eating the acorns and they've switched to something else, whether that's maybe trees starting to sprout in the understories, switching to woody browse, or winter forbs out in those crop fields. It's hard to say, but I think the important thing really is just having that heterogeneity, on your property. Having a variety of foods is the important thing. You can't rely on oaks alone, and you can't rely on food plots alone. You have to have a mixture of different food types.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And Steve, your 2 cents here, but to me it just looks like the relationship is pretty clear that it's post-rut recovery. So these bucks of, we've talked about this many, many times, that might be 10% body weight loss, some 20 or greater percent. So we just have a focus from breeding to feeding, or putting a more focus back into feeding. But then also we have this energy-rich and fat-rich food in the form of acorns. So it's almost like once their mind shifted, the data are pretty clear here, and they went into more of the feeding mode, and then here's something available that's high in carbohydrates, and energy, high in fats, that they really started seeking those acorns out. I never thought, Mariah, it would have been that pronounced. If I were to predict this graph you have now, I would have thought that deer visitation would have been more or less even. There would have been a few little peaks and a few little valleys here and there, but I would have never have dreamed to have seen such a dramatic shift like you found, starting about 5 to 6 weeks after the peak of the rut.
Yeah, and it's I think looking at it from that point of view, looking at this in relation to the rut, if you could apply this response by deer about anywhere across the whitetails range, by shifting when the peak of the rut is, you would expect this response to red oak acorns in the forest. So if we were looking at a Midwestern forest where our acorns are dropping in late September, they're going to be on the ground for a while. We're going to see some deer responding, but then the rut hits beginning of November. The tail end of November is probably when we would see this really large peak in deer use of acorns again. So I think from a hunting point of view, one really big takeaway here is don't discount acorns, hunting acorns after the rut or a little bit later in season. If they're on the ground, deer are going to eat them eventually, provided, looking at deer densities and all that, will depend on how many are eventually eaten by the end of the year, but they're going to respond to that seed, to those acorns if it's available.
Yeah, completely agree. I think your data are really clear on that.
Sure is. And I really want to re-emphasize your great point about a diverse forage supply on your landscape, on your property. Don't just have one thing. They build diversity into your habitat management, and you will have a greater likelihood of deer being on your property for more time of the year. The longer they're on your property, the better chance of them living if you're not harvesting them.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, for anyone managing a property, it's definitely beneficial for you to be making those harvest decisions, provided you have a well-written, management plan or a well-planned out plan of harvest. It's beneficial for you to be making those decisions, and if your property is more attractive, you will have more of those decisions, I guess, and related to your neighbors. And of course, there's a lot of relatedness there in the size of the property and in the quality of deer habitat there. But yeah, from the data here, it's apparent that deer are definitely responding to the mast when it's available. But the another takeaway from this also is that acorns aren't everything to deer, which I think we all know. While there was all these acorns available throughout the year, and I even documented that there's a percentage of acorns that survived underneath these trees that were not eaten, which is an important takeaway as well. There was seed surviving throughout the year. There was this time frame, like Dr. Strickland pointed out, after the rut, needing these high fat foods where acorns filled that void, but we're not seeing them, in November, even prior to the rut, we're not seeing them eating those acorns then. So it's obvious that you wouldn't ever want to manage a forest. If you're managing for deer, you wouldn't want to manage that forest solely for acorn production. And that's not the point of my research at all. But pointing out that, that it does provide this important food or this important energy supply at a crucial time of the year, it fills that void. And I think overall, acorns, oaks can be an important part of your deer management program, but there's obviously a lot of other times of the year. We're just looking at about a 2 or 3 week time span here when deer are responding to it. But then there's the other 50 weeks of the year that we should be thinking about as well.
Yeah, I want to reemphasize that wholeheartedly, Mariah. That's a great statement, because so many hunters get tied up into thinking acorns are the be-all. And if they spend too much time worrying about acorns, which are on the ground for a very short time relative to the rest of the year, they're going to be missing the boat. You do not manage your property for acorn production. You manage it for forage production. Acorns are a part of that forage production, but you have to have forage availability when the deer most need it.
Yeah, and on and I was looking at this from obviously the oak regeneration point of view and the deer response from a land management point of view. And the deer hunter in me, of course, was awoken a little bit because I had all this data looking at, I had the time of day these deer were visiting. I also had whether or not they were bucks, how old they were. And so just to take it a step further in talking about this deer response, I also looked at how deer responded to acorns overall. And looking at the number of photos throughout the study period, we saw a 4 times increase in deer use in these plots and a 3.5 times increase in daylight deer use. So what I did is I actually went through all this data, and for every day I figured in whether it was shooting hours or not. So 30 minutes before sunrise to 30 minutes after sunrise. And I went through my data and looked at all of my detections of deer and how the number of deer visits to my plots was affected, and how that happened between daylight and between shooting hours and not shooting hours. So overall, and this is looking at all deer, so fawns, bucks, does, regardless of age, there was 3.5 times as many deer visits to plots that had the additional acorns than those that didn't. So this would be, from a hunting point of view, this would be sitting under a tree, just a random oak tree in the middle of the woods that didn't produce much mast. You're sitting there with your bow, hunting. You can basically shoot everywhere underneath your tree. If you were sitting under that tree, but you could move to another tree that had produced a bunch of acorns that year, so a mast year, there's a lot more food under it, you would have basically a 3.5 times larger chance of having a deer come and visit that tree during the daylight, so during shooting hours. And in contrast, so we saw that 3.5 times increase in daylight, and at nighttime it was a 4.5 times increase. So what that tells me is that there seems to be maybe a little bit of selection for increased use of these plots or these foods at night, a little bit more so than in daylight. But overall, there's this large increase. And again, so that's looking at deer, all deer across the board. The next thing I wanted to look at was bucks, specifically bucks that are a little bit older. So because of all the photos and data management and everything, I grouped my bucks into 1.5-year-old bucks or 2.5 and older. So looking specifically at just 2.5-year-old bucks and older, or my adult bucks, 2.5 plus. So these were, I had some mature bucks visiting these plots as well. Bucks that, as far as their body, would definitely guess that they were at least 4.5 or older. But overall, the increase in use by bucks was 6 times at night. The response in these acorn addition plots, and 2 times during the day. So if we compare that to deer overall, I see that adult bucks seem to be a little bit less likely to visit these trees in daylight than a doe, than a fawn overall. But there was still this increase in daylight visits by bucks under the trees that had additional acorns. So again, in that same scenario, if you could sit under any oak tree that hadn't produced much mast versus one that had produced a lot of mast that year, you would double your chances by sitting underneath that tree that had produced a lot of mast, which may seem pretty obvious, from what we're talking about, the overall deer response. But again, these numbers show that even the adult bucks respond in daylight. They just seem to respond a little bit better at nighttime than most deer do.
Yeah, I wish the adult bucks, I wish they had responded in our favor a little bit more. So there's no doubt about it. There's an effect there that they are coming to those spots during the daylight more. It's just underwhelming compared to what they're doing at night. So yeah, you're definitely, and think about having a fun hunt too, Mariah, is also it's fun to see deer. And but what your data clearly show is that there's a greater likelihood that you're going to see does and young bucks during daylight hours under these heavy mass trees. The bucks are coming, they're just coming at lesser amounts, except at nighttime, and that's when they're really coming to fill their bellies up.
Right, and I guess one thing that's important to point out here is that maybe these numbers don't represent rut time movement completely, because what I was looking at specifically was deer feeding. So these were numbers of deer coming to feed. And so to your point, if you were hunting under that tree in the first week of December and you had does and fawns coming, there's a pretty good likelihood that a buck may show up there and chase those does around. But my cameras may or may not, catch that buck chasing those does out of there, which you would likely have an opportunity if you were hunting. And then secondly, this data was only looking at the amount of feeding photos of bucks underneath these trees. So it wasn't counting all the running photos through, blurry photos of deer coming through and all that. We kind of control for that by only using the feeding photos, because I was, again, looking at this oak regeneration question and how big of an effect deer were having on oak regeneration or the survival of acorns till spring as a seed predator. So I think during the rut, if we took that into account, you would probably have an even larger chance at adult bucks underneath these trees because of that.
Yeah, you've got acorns there and does.
Absolutely.
Perfect place to be. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this is really interesting stuff, Mariah. It's great to see not just the hunting aspect, but you tackled with Dr. Lashley an ecological problem that has long-term implications to forest health in the eastern United States. And it's easy for us to be very short-sighted, but y'all worked at this long-term problem and learned something that's helpful to understand what's happening.
Yeah, and to just touch on that, on some of the ecological questions I asked with this data, we focused on the deer response because that's super interesting to all of us. But I also looked at how, relating that response to the plant community there as well, and also acorns. So I had, at the beginning of the study, I also put out marked acorns, and I went back and I recovered the marked acorns in all my plots. So I put those in plots where I added acorns in my Acorn Edition plots, and then also the ones where I hadn't. And again, so I looked at the number of acorns I was able to recover at the end of winter to try to get an idea of the percentage of acorns surviving underneath these trees. And even though I documented this big response by deer overall to having more mass, having more acorns available under these trees, obviously we saw deer responding to that. A lot more feeding photos, so they were removing a lot of acorns from these trees. But one important thing, one takeaway, is that even with that, the trees that had a lot more acorns added to them had a higher percentage of acorns surviving till spring that could potentially germinate and turn into an oak tree someday. And so that increase was an 11 times increase. So basically, if you had a tree that had produced very little mast, one of my control trees, or another tree that had a lot of mast, which were my trees where I added acorns, underneath the tree that had a lot of mast, an acorn would have 11 times greater chance of surviving until spring and potentially germinate and turn into an oak tree, which has important implications for the forest management point of view and regenerating oaks into the future. And then another thing we looked at specifically was the plant communities underneath these trees, because when deer respond to acorns, they obviously spend a lot of time underneath those trees. They're disturbing the leaf litter, they're disturbing the soil. And I know personally from hunting, that's something I really look for when I'm hunting, under an oak tree. I look for an oak tree that has a lot of disturbance in the leaf litter, and usually that's a good tree to hunt under because the deer are keying in on that tree that's dropping acorns then. But all that disturbance could potentially have effects on what plants grow there. And then also because deer browse on woody vegetation, they eat forbs, they could affect the plant community that is there. And so I looked at that the following summer after my treatments to see if there was any difference between my trees where I added acorns and those that I didn't. And I found a pretty big difference actually in total coverage of forbs and grasses, rushes and sedges between those trees. So the trees that had additional acorns actually had less coverage of forbs and grasses than the ones that didn't receive acorns. And that was driven mostly by perennial species, and from an ecological point of view, that's likely being driven by deer herbivory. While deer are responding to oaks, they're browsing on the perennial forbs that are still persisting in the understory during winter, and they're affecting whether or not those survive until spring, and then also the total coverage of them. But one thing that we identified from that was that the plant community shifted underneath these trees, and that seemed to be related to this response by deer. So oak masting in itself allows acorns to survive, to germinate, and to hopefully turn into an oak tree, which was the underlying question we were asking. But a really cool side effect of that is that with this deer response, with this response of this, for lack of better words, a seed predator that's also a seedling predator. It's also a forb predator. It's a deer. It eats all kinds of different plant matter. That response of deer is actually changing the plant community, and it's actually promoting heterogeneity in the understory. So in a way, it's promoting species richness of forbs and grasses, and in a way, it's promoting better forest health and better or more heterogeneity in the understory, which kind of like what we talked about earlier, when we're talking about wildlife management in many different species, that is a big benefit. So there's the really cool side effects of oak masting that had never been identified before. And it seems that white-tailed deer, our beloved game animal we all love to chase and eat and become a little bit consumed over chasing, they're also a really cool moderator of the system, and oak masting plays a whole huge role in that and changing their behavior to affect these plant communities. So overall, there was all kinds of intertangled effects and different things that we saw with this research, but it was pretty cool. And from the hunting point of view, it's really encouraging to see that response by deer like we touched on earlier. And I know myself personally, I've paid a lot more attention to oak trees during the rut and post-rut because of that.
Yeah, amazing project, Moriah, amazing findings, and I guess I'll reiterate something you said too, that us biology folks, we've heard the textbook definition of what we call a keystone species, and you just provided a good example of keystone species having a disproportionate effect on other species, in the area when it's added or when it's removed. And by you showing that masting or acorns are dropping, you're bringing other deer in, but that's not the only effect. There's then a secondary, and I'm sure there's a tertiary effect where deer spending time in an area are then going to eat more of the existing plants and affect potentially the plant community down the road. And big picture, when you do this enough places over time, it is literally part of the process in forest dynamics, the bigger role that deer are playing in forest dynamics. So excellent project, Mariah. I think you bring a lot of these different issues to light. So very interesting.
Yeah, it was super cool. And one other thing I didn't add there was this effect on woody species. And we actually saw underneath these trees, an increase in acorn survival until spring. So that's likely going to improve regeneration in the future. But also this effect where, again, herbivory, like I talked about with the forbs and grasses, through herbivory, it seemed to affect the advantage, the growth of oak seedlings, and a pretty common competitor of oak seedlings, which is a black gum seedlings and understory. It actually changed the dynamic between those two, and it seemed that oak masting actually kind of had a negative effect on oak seedlings underneath those trees, while having a positive effect on oak seed survival. So a very multifaceted, very entangled a system, a food web that deer are a very crucial player in. So deer are very cool animals, and I think we're always uncovering another piece about how deer affect the system they live in. So it's very fun to work on that and look specifically at this and kind of uncover something new.
Steve, you have anything to add?
Yeah, I do want to point out, that Mariah has done such a great job here at the MSU Deer Lab with important research that applies to hunters and conservation of hardwood oaks moving forward in the next 50 to 100 years. And he's starting a new kind of phase, a chapter in his life. Mariah, you want to give us some general input on what you're doing next?
Yeah, so I've always wanted to do something in the public realm or work in the wildlife field, and I've always, of course, wanted to work with deer, which is specifically why I took this project. Very deer focused, and I also had a special place in my heart always for upland hardwood systems and prescribed fire and how they all relate. So yeah, moving forward, I actually am going to be working as a deer project coordinator with a state and leading the deer management program. Super excited to kind of move into a different role and the challenges that come with it. There's challenges in every new transition in a career, and so I'm looking forward to that and serving, doing a job to serve the public, a public service job, working for a state agency, working for hunters, for the public, and in managing a deer herd on a much broader level. So that's kind of the overview of what I'm doing, and I think my time here has helped prepare me for that immensely, just in the research and the exposure to classes that have been available at Mississippi State. So not to make too much of a plug for our program, but it has been a great time here doing my research and learning and everything, and has been super helpful in preparing me for the future. So I'm thankful for that.
Well, I need to brag on Mariah for another aspect, is that everybody who engages with the Deer Lab from a social media standpoint, probably 9 times out of 10, every time there was a post, a tweet, and what other forms of social media Mariah had us on, it was Mariah. So thank you, Mariah, for taking the bull by the horns with that and really helping us with that. And Steve and I would might have an idea or a topic or a photograph, and Moriah was great about framing it up, going and taking a video of something and adding it. So he has been our social media manager. He's been a video producer for us. And on the side, he did this really awesome graduate project as well. So we can't say enough great things about you and our appreciation for you, Moriah. And it's always bittersweet at this point when a graduate student finishes, because we're saddened to see you go, but we're also delighted. That's kind of the whole point of coming and getting a master's degree, is to prepare you for the next level and recruit you into the profession. And so we're really happy for you, and we're all going to be here to support you and help you any way we can.
Well, I appreciate that. I've had a great time. It's been awesome working with everyone here, and hopefully we've been able to share something useful from this podcast, and if nothing else from a hunting point of view, hopefully somebody found that interesting. I hope some listener out there will hunt under an oak tree, late in the season and end up shooting, a good deer under it, or a deer they hope to harvest. Something very similar to that happened to me last year, kind of from this data. Actually, I must admit there's probably some perks to being a student, because the tail end of the rut last year, I sat underneath a shoe-marked oak that was dropping and ended up shooting a pretty nice buck there. And so hopefully, what we shared here is interesting to forest managers, to land managers, and also to deer hunters. And because it's hard to manage deer without managing forests, because deer or the plant community that deer rely on, whether it's the forest or the grassland, wherever they're occurring, you can't manage them without managing what they have to eat. So that's my little plug there for this research and all the other great research you guys talk about on the podcast. So it's been a great time, and I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Well, hey, that's a great way to wrap up with a good little hunting recommendation there. Management recommendation and hunting recommendation is don't neglect acorns at the end of the year, or it'd be the end for us where we're located, the end of our hunting season. But 6 weeks or greater after the rut, a lot of people are just totally locked in on food plots. But don't forget about hunting those acorns at that time of year as well. And you are case in point of how it can be a successful strategy to kill a buck.
It is, yep. Tried and true.
And Bronson, Moriah is kind of like that acorn. Came here as a young seedling, and he's now going out and he's going to reach that mid-canopy level. He's going to be successful in his profession, and 20 years from now he'll be reaching out to other young professionals, bringing them into his career line, and those it's all about succession. Some of us are further along in succession than others, and Bronson, you haven't made any jokes about my age in several podcasts now, but
they're coming. They're coming.
If there were a bear or a raccoon looking for a hollowed out oak tree to den in, that would probably be me. And Moriah is that young sapling heading out into the mid-story. And without further ado, I want to just say, hey, if anyone listening to this program today has enjoyed it, what should they do? They need to tell their friends about it, share it on their social media, and get other people to come and listen. Check out the MSUDeerLab.com website. Deer University podcasts, our phone apps. We have a great opportunity for people to learn more about deer management, and deer hunting.
Good way to end. Thanks for the reminder, Steve. We always like to tell people that if you enjoy this media, the information we're putting out, please tell friends and please let us know, because the more positive input that we get, that can motivate us and help us free up time to generate more material. So with more success comes more content. That's our promise to our listeners. So, well, thank you, Steve. Yeah, you successfully navigated a podcast without an age-related joke from me. I thought of some, but I kept it up here. So I'll save them for next time.
Good deal. Mariah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mariah.
Thank you, Mariah, and Godspeed in your new position. Heading out.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We will talk to you soon.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowed financial support of our efforts.
We also thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. If you have questions or suggestions, please log on to msudeerlab.com and click on the Deer University tab.
Natural Resources University is funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. New episodes are released every Tuesday. For more information, follow us on our social media platforms at NR_University.